Recording, Edward? Yes. So Calev, just so you know, we are recording, so plausible deniability. Welcome. Good evening, Calev, member of our community living in Israel. It's wonderful to see you. Do you want to unmute?
Thank you, Rabbi. It's wonderful to be here amongst so many friends.
I hope you had a lovely Shabbat without too much noise.
We did.
Good. So welcome, everybody. As you know, Calev's a member of the community, but also spent 15 years as the National Security Circles in Israel, including as an analyst for Policy Planning Division of the Foreign Ministry. He's currently the Senior Research Associate at BICOM and Deputy Editor of the Fathom Journal. So he knows of what he speaks, which is incredible because, you know, when it comes to Israeli politics, does anybody know anything? But Calev, because he researches and analyzes this and is very reasonable, is going to tell us a little bit tonight about what we should be expecting for this fourth election. And Calev, I'll just do a little brief introduction briefly for myself, which is that my problem is that I never know what are the issues. There's so many potential issues: Israeli-Palestinian, pandemic, Bibi, corruption, ultra-Orthodox, financial issues, the budget, populism. What I'm not good at, I can read about all the different issues. I'm not good at weighing them or what the culture or the atmosphere, the feeling is of Israel at the moment. And if you could explain to us how we got to the fourth election and what it means and what we need to look out for, that'd be fantastic.
I can try. I can certainly try, Rafi. And it's interesting you said that it's the Star Wars election because of May the 4th be with you, because, and we'll get to this, one of the new parties is actually called A New Hope. Tikva Chadasha. So the Star Wars reference is very
okay.
I'm actually not so great at choosing titles for talks, but actually when you come to think about it, fourth time lucky ? We will see for whom the fourth time is lucky. Will it be lucky for the opposition, who have been trying for a long time to replace a prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu? Will it be lucky for Netanyahu himself, that he will finally be able to create this coalition of 61 seats that will allow him to rule in a way that he potentially would want? Will it be lucky for the public in Israel, who will finally get a stable government? And spoiler alert, probably at the end of this talk, the answer will be we don't know. But anyway, I'd like to try and explain partially how we got here and what we can expect. We primarily got here because, and we'll see this a bit later when we look at some of the different parties, no bloc or group of parties were able to get to this magic number of 61 seats. There's 120 seats in the Knesset, so you need 61 to have a majority. And so far, neither the groups that support Netanyahu or oppose Netanyahu were able to coalesce together to get such a coalition. In terms of the issues, so I think normally we always talk about national security issues, kind of leading the way for the public. So what are the main national security issues? There's an issue of Iran and its nuclear plans, and a nuclear deal that is called the JCPOA, that was put together under the Obama administration, that the Biden administration will seemingly look to return to, maybe with some tweaks, plus or minus, which certainly the current government is very opposed to. So that's kind of one major national security issue. There's another major national security issue, which is Iran in Syria trying to establish itself via militias, Hezbollah, which is a very, very serious military force in the north that has over 100,000 rockets facing Israel. Some of those are precision guided. They're particularly dangerous. That's another major issue. There's, of course, the Palestinian issue. And there's also the peace deals, the normalization deals that Israel has signed with the UAE and with Sudan, with Bahrain, with Morocco, that I know Eliav spoke about a few weeks ago. What I'm going to argue is actually none of these are front and center. They may become more front and center as we get closer, but as things stand, And almost always people talk about how they're guided to vote based on national security issues. As we stand, I would argue none of those are front and center. They're certainly not being talked about. So the three previous election cycles, which were, it's kind of difficult to keep count, but the first was in, let's see if I can get this right. The first was in April 2020, then we had one in September, sorry, 2019, then we had one September 2019, then we had one March 2020. What were they about? On the one hand, you had the argument against Netanyahu. Netanyahu is corrupt. He's on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. He puts his own interests in front of those of the country. That was kind of the argument on one side of the political spectrum. And on the other, you had Netanyahu is a statesman. There were all these billboards going up along the motorways of Netanyahu and Trump, Netanyahu and Putin. I think they even, in the posters, they made Putin a bit taller than he is in real life. I guess they didn't want to offend him. But these were all over billboards, and the message was very simple. Netanyahu is a world-respected statesman who can get things done, who people listen to, and those were kind of the two main things. Now, those posters with Trump have since been taken down, and I think there's an open question. I genuinely don't know the answer whether Netanyahu's very close bear hug relationship with Trump is still considered an asset or a liability. I don't know the answer to that, but that was, I would argue, in the three previous elections, those were the main issues. And you had Blue and White, the main opposition party, who were saying, we are basically non-corrupt. And you had Netanyahu saying, I am a statesman. And those were the two positions. So what's the fourth one about? So it's still very much, I would argue, a referendum on Netanyahu. And when we think about what's changed over the last year, I think there's probably more people who feel that Netanyahu puts his personal interests above those of the country. Certainly, and we'll get to this, one of the new parties, New Hope, which was formed by many former members of Likud, who would perhaps argue we are the original Likud. We still have these kind of liberal nationalist values, would certainly feel that Netanyahu in some ways has lost his way. I think we're now on the 33rd or the 34th consecutive week of demonstrations outside the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. So we have that on the one hand. We still have this big referendum on Netanyahu. We have the government's handling, or others would say mishandling, of COVID. Large numbers of deaths, I think 5,500 people. And if you think about it, the Intifada, there were 1,000, over 3-4 years, 1,000 Israelis were killed. We've had 5,500 people killed from COVID. The airport was left open. There were no checks. Professional echelon recommendations were ignored. A lot of people felt the government was playing politics with people's lives. But we also have a very, very successful vaccination drive. So again, where are we? What's the fourth one about? It's still a referendum on Netanyahu, a year on. There's the government's handling or mishandling of COVID, which has been both good and bad at different stages. A huge economic and unemployment challenge. There's 1 million people who are unemployed. Small businesses have gone bankrupt because of the closures, because of the lockdowns. I think that's a huge issue for people.
Have you had furloughing in a similar way to England in terms of government support in a major way or not in Israel? I actually don't know.
So, listen, I'm wary of compare and contrast, and I'm also wary of talking about things that I understand less. Having said that, my understanding is that the government in the UK did give better support to UK small businesses. We haven't had a budget since 2018. And I think, there's a lot of people who are very supportive of Netanyahu and would say, Maybe he's corrupt, maybe he isn't. We don't really care. He brought peace with the UAE. He's brought, a strong security situation. Only he can stand up to Biden. There's a lot of things that people would say about Netanyahu. I think where it really falls down is there has not been a budget.
Okay, could you explain, because we all know budgets are important, but what are the 3 or 4 major factors that not having a budget for 2 years in an entire country has led to or means?
When you don't have a budget, it means that you have to, all of the government, all of the ministries, so the defense, foreign, finance, justice, education, all run on a monthly, everything gets divided up into 12. They run on a kind of monthly thing. And all of the additions that you may want to do for projects, I don't know, youth at risk, maybe the defense ministry needs more planes, whatever it is, you are kind of struggling to find that money because it doesn't really exist. So I think one of the major criticisms, and I think even the people that would give Netanyahu very strong marks on security and other things would find it difficult to explain why there isn't a budget, other than a very cynical reason that the Prime Minister wanted kind of an out before handing over power as part of a rotation agreement to Benny Gantz, who's the alternate Prime Minister. So I don't really want to get into the UK stuff because I don't know a huge amount about it, but the economic issue is huge at the moment. And increasingly, another major issue, I would say, is the role of Haredim in the public sphere. That increasingly more and more, listen, statistics only tell a certain story, but I think Haredim are 12% of the population, and they are 40% of the COVID cases. And there are all sorts of examples of different groups and different sectors who perhaps paid more attention or less attention to government restrictions, but only in the Haredi world were the leaders actively telling people to ignore things. And the fact is, a lot of people's children, including mine, have not been at school for a huge amount of time. So our daughter is 3.5. So I don't think her education has suffered, but there's a lot of people very angry that their children have missed a year of school. And there's one sector in Israel whose children have not missed a year of school. And I think that is an increasing issue. And the perception or the feeling that, again, because of politics, because Netanyahu relies on the Haredim for support to continue being prime minister, some of the decisions haven't been as they should. So again, what's the fourth one about? It's still about Netanyahu's leadership. It's about COVID, the health aspect, the economic aspect, and the role of the Haredim. Now, in an article I recently wrote, that I think Edward sent in the link, I basically argued that there's a Bibi bet going on. I called it the King's Gambit, and the gambit is as follows: when we get to March the 23rd, if the economy has improved a bit, and the majority of the country have been vaccinated and shops are open, then I think the bet is that people will focus on that and they will forget a lot of the chaos that has happened over the last year, on the one hand. And on the other hand, if it hasn't, then you could well have a lot of the anger coming out, and I think the government will be in trouble. So I think that's what the fourth election is really about. And I just want to take a couple of steps back in terms of what going into this election, what's good for Netanyahu and what's less good for Netanyahu. So the good thing for Netanyahu is that in elections 1, 2, and 3, there was a very strong, serious opposition party called Blue and White. It was an amalgamation of 4 different parties that was polling at 30 plus seats and was really seen as a very strong alternative to his leadership. That's collapsed. There is no alternative party polling at such levels. Benny Gantz's decision to enter the government, I understand why he did it. It has proven to be an absolute disaster for his party. They are polling very, very close to the electoral threshold. The closest party to Netanyahu is a kind of center-left alternative called Yesh Atid. There is a perception that it has a ceiling of 20 seats. So, for Netanyahu, this is great. The main opposition has been completely fractured. The other very good thing for Netanyahu is there are several anti-Netanyahu parties that are polling very, very close to the electoral threshold. Now, the electoral threshold in Israel, again, I'm sure people know this, there's a proportional representation system, one person, one vote. You need 3.25% to get into the Knesset. You need around 130,000 votes. That gets you 4 seats. If you get under that, you get 0. And those seats then get fed back into everyone else. There are several parties that are polling very close to that. Blue and White is one of them. Meretz, a left-wing party, is another. There is an Arab party that is also polling under, but there's a question about the polling, to what extent they're able to get to speak to a lot of Bedouin in the Negev, who primarily will vote for this party. This is very good for Netanyahu. These votes are anti him, and they could go to waste. So those are the two very good things for Netanyahu.
Is there a chance the last minute Blue and White will join up with Yesh Atid, or that won't happen now because?
So the date for handing in the lists is over. The normal mergers is that you can have dropouts. You can have a dropout a week, however long before.
And they say all vote for. I'm backing this.
There is. Rafi and I spoke on Friday, and we talked about the questions, and one of the answers that I've got stored for later is a crazy scenario, which I'll throw out now. It's an absolutely crazy scenario, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. That in I think May or June 2020, when Gantz and Netanyahu signed this rotation government, it means Netanyahu is prime minister for the first 18 months, and then Gantz becomes prime minister. To become prime minister, Gantz needs to be an MK. He needs to be in Knesset. In a scenario, which is an insane scenario, but in a scenario where the 4th elections end in stalemate, and we go to a 5th election, which I realize sounds absolutely insane, and Gantz is still an MK. In November, if nothing happens, Gantz becomes prime minister.
I thought in May, no? Or...
In November 2021, if there is no new government and Gantz is a Knesset member, he becomes prime minister. Now, I don't think that will happen, but if you're Gantz and you're defense minister and you're the alternative prime minister and you're polling close to the threshold, on the one hand, people will say, pull out, you're wasting votes, you're potentially giving Netanyahu a lifeline. On the other hand, if he does stay in and if he gets in, then it adds this very, very interesting scenario for November. So I don't think that's going to happen, but who knows? So there will potentially be pressure on Gantz to pull out, but he can't merge anymore. Right. So the good things for Netanyahu is there is no major big opposition, and there are several small parties polling very close to the threshold that are all anti him and could disappear. The big challenge for Netanyahu is that there is now a right-wing alternative, which there hasn't been in the last 3 elections. And that right-wing alternative comes in the form of Gideon Saar, who is a long-time, quite not particularly charismatic, I'd say, but very popular, both in the media and within Likud. And he's created a list of, I'd call it, old-time Likudniks. So Benny Begin, Menachem Begin's son, Yitzhak Shamir's granddaughter, several leaders of the settlement movement like Dani Dayan and others. And Saar's argument is really, Likud under Netanyahu has lost its way. It's become a party of one. And I am the original Likud. Sar is, by the way, by far more right-wing than Netanyahu. And he really does pose, I would argue, a challenge to Netanyahu. Netanyahu wants to frame it as it's me against Yair Lapid, but actually he never mentions Gideon Sa'ar. And there's also Naftali Bennett from Yamina, who's also to the right of Netanyahu on many issues. And so suddenly Netanyahu has this kind of right-wing challenge as well.
How big are each of those, of Yamina and
we'll get to
okay, fine.
I want to share a slide that we put together at BICOM, and I want to try and explain why it's so difficult to get to 61. Now, hopefully can people see this? Rafi, can you see this?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So these circles are in general the sizes. Okay, so Likud is very big, Yesh Atid is also close. So this is a kind of two-dimensional look at the issues. The ones nearer the top support Netanyahu, the ones nearer the bottom oppose Netanyahu. The ones further to the right have a more right-wing position on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and the ones more to the left have a more left-wing position on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So, lots of parties are similar on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To hold on to the West Bank or to annex it or to keep the status quo. You can have quite a homogenous coalition on that issue of Likud, a party called Religious Zionism, Yamina, New Hope, Yisrael Beitenu, they're all in blue. That could get you to 61 pretty easily. What's the problem? They have very, very different positions on Netanyahu, good or bad. They can't sit together. Now, if you look at everyone who's on the bottom bit, they all agree on the anti-Netanyahu bit. You have such a plethora of positions from New Hope and Yamina who are kind of on the annexationist right to Labour and Meretz on the Zionist left to the Joint List, which is an Arab party. They also can't all sit together. And if you add in a third dimension now, which is the ultra-Orthodox issue, it kind of makes it almost impossible. You have certain parties that will sit with the ultra-Orthodox, pro and anti-Netanyahu, and you have certain parties that most likely or absolutely won't sit with the ultra-Orthodox in the anti-Netanyahu camp. So you know, when you look at this and you try and create this 61, whichever way you go, and by the way, this will be exactly the same challenge on March the 24th, the day after the election as it is now. Whichever way you look, you hit upon an issue that enough parties disagree on that they can't really get to 61. So Rafi asked about the numbers and the polling, which I'll touch on now, and just a couple of comments about this before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty. I love polling. I follow polling. I aggregate polling. I love polling. I'm also very aware that we should not overestimate the accuracy of polling. Polling gives us a general look at what's going on. I read this week that there are about 1 in 6 people who are undecided. That does not appear here. There's 18 seats worth out of 120 of people who have not decided who they're voting for. There is a 4% margin of error. Now, 4% is about 5 seats. In close elections, 5 seats is super significant. 5 seats is the difference between a clear Netanyahu victory and a big Netanyahu defeat. That's in the margin of error. And we said this already, there are several parties very, very close to the electoral threshold. If they get over, that will mean one thing. If they get under, that will mean something else. So So I just looked in the last half an hour to try and update this. It's very, very small change, which is religious Zionism is up 1 to 5, Likud is down 1 to 28. It doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. New Hope is down 1 to 13. Yesh Atid is up 1 to 18. It doesn't really make a difference. But what you'll see here is that Yamina, which is Naftali Bennett's party, has on the one hand said that Netanyahu should not be prime minister anymore. On the other hand, is very much sitting on the fence as to whether they will ultimately join a Likud-led government. And so what we have here is, the big question is, can Likud and its allies get to 61? Based on this, they can get to 59 with Yamina. But we're 6 weeks out. A lot can change. And the margin of error is too close to call. So to kind of go back to, let me just stop.
I mean, just if I can ask on that, Gantz was clearly anti-Bibi, but ended up in a deal of government with him. So it's very possible that Gideon Saar, if he gets a good number of seats and gets control of certain things, will do a deal with Bibi and have a really strong right-wing government. No.
So I think, listen, I personally do not. I think Saar has crossed the Rubicon. He left Likud. He's gone out on his own, and he's with some very serious right-wingers who think Netanyahu has gone off the derech. Bennett absolutely could join, and there's a very strong chance that Likud could get over 61. And there's also a chance that a kind of, if you go back to the axis, that the groups on the bottom from right to left could also get together, and they could focus on COVID and renewing the economy and sorting out the rest of the vaccines and kind of returning Israel to some sort of new path, putting aside their very deep disagreements on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and moving forward. But the truth is, we don't know. 6 weeks is a long time in politics, and the polls are too close to call, and 1/6 of people haven't even decided. So that's kind of where we are, or where we aren't, if you like, at the current juncture.
Gosh, well, it sounds like a real mess, as always in Israeli politics. What are some of the kind of the language that's being thrown around by people in terms of the political issues? Like, how's Bibi trying to get people behind him, or how Salah? What's the kind of, is it very inflammatory language like we saw was happening in American elections, or is it slightly calmer now? And it's it's reasoned debate, it's arguments, or is it quite over the top? How would you characterize it?
I'm not sure the last time we had reasoned debate, to be honest. It's not really the Israeli way. I think the direction that Netanyahu wants to take things, and this is based on previous things, is it's me or the left. And the irony here is that, people might disagree. I don't really think that, firstly, and this is something that I was saying to Rafi on Friday, that the worst thing one can be called in Israel is a friar, okay, a sucker. The second worst thing one can be called in Israel is a leftist, okay, smolani. Because smolani, when it kind of gets said in an aggressive way, Rafi said it's the equivalent of kind of being called a socialist in America. That in Europe, this idea of, I don't know, maybe having a national health service, all sorts of things are kind of taken as obvious, but in America is kind of, you're on your way to becoming the Soviet Union. So in Israel, being a leftist means you're treacherous, you're not a patriot, etc. And generally, the way that Netanyahu likes to frame things is either it's me or the left. Now, the left, I don't think really exists that much in Israel. It's certainly not particularly strong. Or another one is, it's either me or a coalition with the Arabs. So that's kind of been the previous ones. But actually, this time Netanyahu has kind of gone on this kind of charm campaign within the Arab sector of saying, listen, vote for Likud. You can have influence. You want to integrate, I can do that. I'm not sure to what extent the Arab community will so easily forget some of the more inflammatory statements that the Prime Minister has made in the past. But just to go back to your question, I think one of the framings will be it's me or the left, and Lapid is part of the left, and Lapid needs the Arabs in order to get a coalition. Listen, I think the Netanyahu as statesman is a very strong one.
Yes, what you explained to me on Friday is that you're saying that he's still setting the agenda. Like the language is all around what he's saying, and that's a key issue as well. No one's managed to grab that from him.
Very, very good at setting the agenda. I brought you peace. I would. There was a planned visit to the United Arab Emirates in February, early February. It got cancelled because the airport was closed. But I would not be surprised if there's some sort of visit before March.
Right.
I don't know if anyone's been following. There's a very, very strange story of a Haredi woman, or formerly Haredi woman, who somehow crossed the border into Syria. I don't know if anyone's been following this, and it has just been returned. Most likely, was only in return for 2 Syrian shepherds, and according to reports, Israel paying $1 million to buy Russian vaccines for Assad and his friends. But what I want to focus on is what Netanyahu emphasizes is it was my close relationship with Putin that got this over the line. There's going to be America, Iran talk. Netanyahu might kind of frame the only I can deal with Biden, or only I can stand up to Biden. The opposition might say, well, bipartisanship has been destroyed because you cozied up to Trump. That's your fault. Only the opposition can restore that. I think these are probably going to be some of the issues. But I also think that in some ways we're in a post-issue place.
Yeah.
And listen, COVID is a very serious issue. The economy, a very serious issue. But I think also it's about personalities. It's about, like Bibi, do you not like Bibi? Do you rate Lapid? Do you not? Do you think Saar offers a good alternative? Do you not? Do you like Merav Michaeli, who's the new leader of Labour, or does she turn you off? I think in many ways we've kind of moved past the issues into the personalities. But listen, personalities are important. Personalities and their values help to shape society. So, that's also important.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to open this up for questions from people if they want to ask. But it's been very useful what you explained to us, all the different factors and weighing them up, and how they will change in the next 6 weeks depending on what happens in the news and what the opportunities are, and then the different factors you've mentioned will get bigger and smaller, and I'll be watching for that. But are there questions that people want to ask? Do you have if you want to write in the chat, or you want to unmute and ask a question, ask me, then I will give you the conch. Anybody like to ask? Yes.
Calev, quick question. Do you think what's happening with Netanyahu and the case against him in the courts? Is that going to be a factor, or is that going to go into abeyance while the election goes on?
So listen, it's an excellent question. The evidentiary stage of the trial, which is for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, was supposed to, well, I don't know when it was supposed to start, but one of the more recent start dates was February. It was then delayed because of lockdown. And then it was, the evidentiary stage was postponed until after the election. The Netanyahu argument is that, well, there's 2 Netanyahu arguments. One Netanyahu argument is that all of these things were cooked up by the left in order to topple a Likud-led government. And actually, instead of Netanyahu being on trial, it's not just Netanyahu, it's everyone. It's all of the right wing on trial. The problems with this factually are that this is the same justice ministry that sent a left-wing prime minister, Ehud Olmert, to jail. It also relies on a theory that a right-wing religious from Kiryat Arba police chief and a right-wing religious attorney general who's been very close to Netanyahu for years was somehow influenced by this amorphous left wing that doesn't exist in Israel in order to put these cases on Netanyahu.
That's how good they are, you see. That's how good it is.
That's how good it is. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a little bit like the Democrats were so smart to steal the election, but still managed to make the Senate race really, really close. That was kind of how sophisticated.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, similar.
But no, the evidentiary stage has been postponed. Will it make a difference? So I would have said yes, other than the fact that I've already lived through 3 election cycles where this made no difference at all. And I think we're now at the stage where I would kind of divide the country into 3, I don't know what proportions, but 3. People who think, or maybe even 4, people who think Netanyahu is guilty, people who think it's all a conspiracy and he's innocent, people who don't really care because Netanyahu is the greatest leader we've had since Ben-Gurion, or even better than that. And people think that the court needs, the system needs to go through its way, and maybe Netanyahu has kind of been overly focused on that rather than running the country, and therefore he needs to be replaced. But I'm not convinced that any of those people get influenced by the trial, as in that's already been kind of just like, markets feed in future events. So the trial has been rolling on for a long time now, and we've had 3 elections, and it didn't seem to make a difference in 1, 2, and 3. So I can't really imagine why it would make a difference in number 4. But it's a great question. Yeah.
So that's the extent of corruption. Do we have other questions you want to ask, Calev? Here's your chance.
Well, there's something from Margaret and Pinchas.
No, but it's not a question.
It's not a question. There's 2 questions. So I'm always. Anyway,
who's going to ask? It's Clive.
It
Clive
was
and then
a
Michael.
question.
Sure.
Do you want to, Clive, do you want to ask?
I'll just touch on they're old friends. I see Vivian's getting into there's a whole debate to what extent.
If everybody else can mute, because it's making lots of background noise.
Calev, can I?
Is everyone muted?
Yeah.
Yes.
So Clive, if you ask a question. If you unmute and ask a question.
Calev, very illuminating talk, and thank you very much. You've identified 2 possible results. The more likely is that Netanyahu does not get 61 seats, a majority. The less likely that he does get a majority. But what prospect change if there's no obvious contender for new prime minister? At least before we knew that Gantz was a contender, the other people that you've identified are leaders of parties, but not parties that are likely to get a very substantial following from other parties. What chance that somebody else is going to emerge as a new prime minister?
So Clive, I want to tell you a story which takes place between election 1 and election 2. A cousin of mine asked me, what do I think is going to happen? So this was a stage when Netanyahu was very, very close to getting 61. Lieberman was refusing to sit with the ultra-Orthodox. People thought maybe there's going to be some sort of compromise. And I said, listen, I don't know what's going to happen, but I can tell you one thing for certain. There will not be a second election. So that kind of just goes to show my powers of prediction. And something that you didn't mention is we could be heading towards a 5th. It's very possible. I wouldn't give more likely or less likely about who can get to 61. I think Netanyahu and his allies are close. But the big question that you touched on is, okay, if that does not happen, then where are we? Based on current polls, so you've got one party who are on 18 to 20, you've got another party who are low teens, got another party who are low teens, and can you get to a kind of 61 with lots and lots of small parties all joining? And how can it be that you could have a prime minister who potentially gets 20 seats or even 15 seats. How can that be? And I don't have a good answer for you, other than we are in historic times, or we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis, which is based on someone being indicted and not resigning, and the country kind of being divided between those who love him and those who despise him, and we're stuck. And in that sort of situation, almost anything can happen. So could you have a scenario where Yair Lapid joins with Gideon Saar and Bennett from the right, and Benny Gantz, if he gets in, and Merav Michaeli on the left, and they kind of get supported from the outside by the Arab Joint List, and they kind of have this minority government, and Netanyahu goes home and Likud kind of regenerate, and then we kind of have a year and then it all collapses again. Listen, that is a possibility. Does it offer stability? No. Is it the likely scenario? I genuinely have no idea, but we're in a place now where we are stuck. And the key will be, can Netanyahu get 61 or not? I would just remind everyone that in each of the last 3 elections, Netanyahu and his allies did not succeed in getting 61. In the first one, they were very close. They didn't. In the second one, I think they ended up with 55. In the third one, they got 58, and then Gantz came in. So listen, that was a very long answer to me saying I don't know. But yes, there is a scenario in which a plethora of smaller parties are able to get over the 61 simply in order to send Netanyahu home.
Right.
And then I think everything might kind of reorder itself. I think that is a possibility, but just as likely is Netanyahu gets 61 or close and then manages to kind of tear other people away to join a coalition and offers them all sorts of things and then kind of gets over the line. That's also a real possibility.
We've got time for a few more questions. I saw Michael Teacher, but you put your hand up earlier for the next one. So do you want to ask quickly?
No, I think this situation has now been going on for so many years, and without a change in the constitution, it looks like it will go on forever. I can't see what's going to change anything because of the way the election is structured and because of the proportional representation. And I can't see that changing because of the way the Knesset is based. So I think you're in this circle that just will never change. I'm feeling pretty depressed about it all. Is there any chance that anything could be changed there?
Listen, Michael, it's funny because what we always used to say is if only we had the British model. Their politics are so stable, it's really healthy there, and then that kind of also people stop making that joke basically in the last couple of years. I'd say this, listen, until April 2019, the proportional representation was not a problem. So it's become a problem, but it wasn't until then. The idea of a constitution would be wonderful. We are far away from that. So just to go off on a bit of a tangent, because you asked, I think one of the really interesting things that's changed is the electoral threshold was raised from maybe 1.5%, 2% to 3.25%. And that the idea was we'll get rid of lots of the small parties. What it did is it just meant parties merged, and that caused other problems. And before then, we had this idea of, you vote twice. You vote for prime minister and you vote for party. And that idea was it will strengthen the prime minister vis-a-vis the smaller parties. What did it do? It meant more people split their vote. It meant you would, in theory, instead of voting for Likud because you like Netanyahu, you'd vote for Netanyahu and then you'd vote for a smaller party. So it actually made it worse. So we are constantly struggling to find some sort of stable solution. We're not there. And in terms of the things you suggested, I don't think we're going to be there for a while.
Yeah, and the new politics is not around the corner. Absolutely. There's a couple more questions. Evan and Larry, I see you've got your hand up. And then I've got one from Yuki I'm going to ask. But Evan and Larry, do you want to ask yours?
Yeah, Calev, good to see you. Looking in your crystal ball, could you see a situation where enough parties get together to form 61, get 61 seats to box out the Haredim? So this way, a small minority within Israel does not have the undue influence they have?
So listen, it's a great question. The Haredim do not want to be. One second, if someone can unmute, can mute.
Yeah, I've just been muting people, yeah.
The Haredim do not generally ever want to be the issue in elections. And unfortunately for them, they have become it. I think there's a lot of anti-Haredi feeling. I think that strengthens Lapid. I think it strengthens Lieberman. When you start crunching the numbers, you get to the following. It is very, very difficult to get to 61 without either the Haredim or the Arab parties, between one or two of them, unless you're going for some sort of national unity government. So I think that there's a big push against the influence of the Haredim. Whether parties will be able to get to 6, well, you know, the anti-Netanyahu parties of Saar and Bennett and Lapid and Labour and Meretz, etc., maybe with support from the outside, if they could get one, maybe it's a possibility. But, you know, when you look at the three-dimensional axis of Netanyahu, yes or no, Israeli-Palestinian issues, right or left, and Haredim, in or out, in some ways, you can only really choose either one or two out of those three.
Right.
So which the issue will be to get to 61, I don't know, but certainly I think that there's this very strong anti-Haredi feeling amongst a lot of sectors within Israel at the moment.
Yeah, and Bibi also has the power, very good at dividing the people who are against him, so to stop those things. I've got a question from Yichi, who says, Calev, don't you think that the resumption of Biden's same team attempting to resurrect the Iran deal would be very helpful for Netanyahu?
Yeah, listen, Yichi, it's a great question. I think I'll argue this both ways. The Americans are returning to a very, I'm paraphrasing, the Americans are returning to a very, very dangerous nuclear deal that will allow the Iranians to get the bomb. And only I, Netanyahu, have the experience I've shown in the past that I can stand up against the Democrats. I did it against Obama, and only I can protect you Israelis from this impending disaster, is one argument. Another argument is, we have lost our influence with the Americans because we, in brackets, you, Netanyahu, played the partisan game. And there's a lot of things in America that are increasingly partisan and very difficult to discuss. But Israel very often was not one of them. There was bipartisanship. But because Netanyahu, you firstly were so disrespectful to Obama, you went to Congress, you spoke against the thing, you then jumped into bed with a very controversial president who the Democrats despise, and the Democrats are now in power. You have weakened our hand against influencing the administration. Now, listen, I'd actually argue that both, you know, you could quite easily make both of those arguments. Will those arguments be made? Probably, one by Netanyahu and one by Lapid and Saar, etc. Will it sway anyone? I tend to think that the COVID stuff is so fresh and raw that will really be the thing that when you're in the ballot box, that's what you'll be thinking about. But could Iran and Biden be an issue sometime in March? Yeah, absolutely. Who will it benefit? It could go either way.
Okay, and I've got another question here from Joan. Every country is divided roughly 50-50 these days. Well, not everybody, a lot of countries, absolutely. Do you think it's likely that even more little parties will turn up and divide the vote more and more? I mean, not in this election, but going further. Do you think it's going to get worse and worse?
So we have lots of little parties. We have the Pirates. We have an Israeli Economy Party. And we have lots of parties that pulled out. In some ways, because you need 140,000-ish votes, it means that there's not really an incentive to start small niche parties. So, when we Israelis go into the ballot box, we see these kind of 40 different little slips, each one with their own letters on them, and each of those are small parties. But because the threshold has been raised, and it's pretty difficult to get 140,000 votes. So I don't foresee more small parties, but listen, I'll tell you, either it's a joke or it's not a joke. Analysts have been predicting the end of the Netanyahu era for at least since 2015, if not beforehand. One day they will be right. How close that day is, I've got no idea. But I do think that Israeli politics after Netanyahu will reorder themselves. There are a lot of people eyeing becoming the leader of the right wing, whether that's within Likud, so Nir Barakat, Yoav Gallant, Yudi Edelstein, or now outside of Likud, Gideon Saar, Naftali Bennett, maybe even Avigdor Lieberman. There's a lot of people all eyeing up this leadership of the right wing. I think in a post-Netanyahu politics, the parties will rejig themselves. I just don't think that will be in the form of very, very small parties.
Right, right. Well, look, Calev, thank you very much. It's been fascinating. It's amazing we get really into this at the time, and then after it happens, it changes and it all reinvents. But what you taught us also is the underlying issues that are not going to go away in terms of corruption issues in general in Israel society, and the Iran deal, and UAE and the Palestinians. And these are ongoing issues. We pray for the best for the country and for you, but we don't know. So we want to thank you very much for giving us some time. I'm not going to ask you who you're going to vote for. But you've got lots of choice, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Lovely to see you all.
Helen and David.
And David.
Thank you. Thank you.